It was just another evening in the city, the streets buzzing with life as people rushed home from work or gathered with friends. The air carried the scent of street food, mixed with the occasional honk of impatient drivers. Among the crowd was Big Shaq, a towering man with a warm heart and a booming laugh that could lighten up even the gloomiest of days. Dressed in his signature oversized jacket, he strolled down the sidewalk, nodding at passers-by and occasionally stopping for a quick chat with those who recognized him. Shaq had always been the kind of guy who believed in spreading positivity. Whether it was cracking jokes with strangers or helping someone carry their grocery bags, he never let the world's negativity get to him. But on this particular evening, something happened that tested his patience like never before. As he reached the corner of a busy intersection, a woman stormed out of a cafe, her face twisted with anger. She was in her mid-50s, well-dressed, and held a cup of coffee in one hand while clutching her designer handbag with the other. The moment her eyes landed on Shaq, something in her expression changed. Disgust, fury, or maybe a mix of both. "Get out of my way," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the city noise. Shaq, caught off guard, took a step back. He hadn't even noticed her before she spoke. "Sorry, miss, didn't mean to be in your way," he said politely, offering a small smile. But the woman wasn't done. Her face turned red, and before anyone could process what was happening, she did something shocking. She spit at him. A stunned silence fell over the people nearby. Time seemed to freeze as the spit landed on Shaq's jacket, an ugly stain not just on the fabric but on the moment itself. The crowd gasped, some pulling out their phones, others whispering in disbelief. Shaq's body stiffened. For a split second, a wave of emotions crashed over him. Shock, anger, humiliation. He could feel the weight of every eye watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The old Shaq, the one from years ago, might have reacted differently. But now he knew better. He exhaled slowly, wiping his jacket with a napkin someone handed him. "You good?" he asked the woman, his voice calm, though his eyes burned with unspoken words. The woman scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "People like you think you own the streets," she muttered under her breath. The crowd murmured louder now, some stepping forward, ready to call her out. But before anyone could, something unexpected happened. Something that no one, not even Shaq, saw coming. The moment hung heavy in the air, the tension thick enough to stop time. The woman stood there, her arms crossed, eyes filled with cold resentment, while the crowd around them buzzed with murmurs of disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust, others whispered angrily among themselves. A few had their phones out, capturing everything, knowing this would be all over the internet in no time. Shaq didn't move right away. He took another deep breath, steadying himself, his mind racing with thoughts. He wasn't a stranger to situations like this. Growing up, he had faced plenty of people who judged him before even knowing him. But this was different. This wasn't some online troll hiding behind a screen. This was real. This was a woman standing just inches away from him, so full of hate that she had spit on him in broad daylight. A younger man in the crowd stepped forward. He looked furious. "You can't just do that," he said, his voice firm. "What is wrong with you?" The woman rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "This has nothing to do with you. Mind your business." But it was everyone's business now. The energy on the street had shifted. People were no longer just passing by. They were invested. Some stood in silence, waiting to see what Shaq would do. Others whispered, debating whether they should call the police or step in themselves. Shaq finally wiped the last of the spit from his jacket, his fingers pressing against the fabric for a moment longer than necessary. His heart pounded, but he refused to let the anger take over. He had worked too hard to become the man he was today, someone who didn't let hate turn him into something he wasn't. He looked the woman in the eyes, his gaze steady. "You don't even know me," he said, his voice low but controlled. "And yet, here we are." The woman let out a dry laugh. "I don't need to know you," she shot back. "I've seen enough of your kind." There it was. the words she had been holding back, now out in the open. The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, others muttered angrily under their breath. A woman in the back shook her head in disgust. A man near the front rubbed his temples as if trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Shaq felt his stomach tighten, but he refused to let this moment define him. Instead, he turned to the people watching. "Y'all see this?" he asked, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This right here. This is why we got work to do." The younger man who had spoken earlier nodded. "Yeah man, this ain't right." The woman scoffed again, but this time, there was something else in her eyes. Nervousness. Maybe she hadn't expected so many people to be against her. Maybe she thought she could get away with it, that no one would call her out. But now, all eyes were on her, and the weight of the moment seemed to sink in. Still, she wasn't backing down. "You're making a scene," she snapped. "I have places to be." Shaq let out a small chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "I didn't make this scene. You did." The tension in the air was almost unbearable now. People shifted uncomfortably, some still recording, others unsure of what to do next. A security guard from a nearby store had stepped outside, watching carefully. It was clear that no one was going to just walk away from this. Not yet. And then, just as the energy reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, tugged at Shaq's sleeve. She had been standing behind her mother, who had been watching the whole thing unfold with wide eyes. The girl looked up at Shaq with big, curious eyes, her voice small but clear. "Mister," she said, "are you okay?" The question was so simple, so pure that it cut through the tension like a knife. The crowd fell silent, their attention shifting to the little girl. Even the woman who had started all of this seemed momentarily taken aback. Shaq looked down at the girl and smiled, his expression softening. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm okay." The girl nodded, satisfied with his answer, and turned back to her mother, gripping her hand. The innocence in her question seemed to remind everyone of something important, something bigger than this moment. But just as the air seemed to lighten, the woman, unwilling to let go of her bitterness, shook her head. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, adjusting her handbag. "People like him always play the victim." The crowd reacted instantly, some stepping closer, ready to call her out again. But before anyone could say another word, Shaq raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He wasn't going to let her get to him. He had already decided that. But what happened next, no one saw coming. Because at that very moment, a man appeared from the cafe, the same cafe the woman had stormed out of earlier. He was holding something in his hands, something small, but with an expression so serious that it made everyone pause. And when the woman saw him, her face went pale. For the first time since this whole thing started, she looked afraid. The crowd turned to see what had shaken her so much. And when they did, everything changed. The crowd turned their attention to the man stepping out of the cafe. He was tall and middle-aged, wearing a simple button-up shirt. His sleeves rolled to his elbows. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his presence that immediately shifted the energy. In his hands, he held a phone, gripping it tightly as he walked closer. The woman's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked uneasy. Her confidence, the sharpness in her tone, the arrogance in her stance, it all started to crack. She took a small step back, her gaze flicking between the man and Shaq, as if trying to figure out what was about to happen. Shaq noticed her reaction and narrowed his eyes slightly. He had no idea who this man was or why he had such an effect on her, but something told him that whatever was about to unfold had deeper layers than what was visible on the surface. The man finally stopped a few feet away from the woman, lifting his phone slightly. His voice was calm but firm. "I saw everything," he said. "And so did my camera." The woman flinched. The crowd stirred, people whispering to each other, some stepping closer to get a better look at the man's phone. Shaq remained still, watching carefully. He wasn't sure what was on that recording, but judging by the woman's reaction, it was enough to rattle her. You should be ashamed of yourself, the man continued, shaking his head. This isn't just about him, he gestured toward Shaq. This is about the kind of person you are when you think no one is watching. The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time she looked lost. Shaq wasn't sure what to feel in that moment. Part of him wanted to move on, to not let this situation define his night, but another part of him knew this was bigger than him. This was about accountability. About people like this woman believing they could do or say anything and face no consequences. The younger man from earlier folded his arms. So what now? He asked, looking at the woman. You just gonna stand there and pretend you didn't just spit on this man? The crowd murmured in agreement, the pressure on the woman growing. Some people were still recording, their phones pointed at her. This moment would live beyond the street. It would reach timelines, news feeds, and maybe even the news. The woman's breath quickened, her fingers tightening around her handbag strap. I don't have to explain myself to you people, she said, her voice quieter now. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. He wasn't interested in dragging this moment out. But before he could say anything, the man with the phone spoke again. You always do this, don't you? He said, his voice lower this time. There was something in the way he said it, like he knew her. Like this wasn't the first time he had seen her act this way. The woman's expression hardened, but her eyes betrayed something else. Recognition. Shaq caught it instantly. He looked between the two of them, piecing together the unspoken tension. Y'all know each other? Shaq finally asked. The man nodded, his eyes still locked on the woman. Yeah, he said. I know exactly who she is. A chill ran through the crowd. People leaned in closer, waiting for what would come next. The woman inhaled sharply. That's enough, she snapped. This is getting ridiculous. She turned quickly as if to leave, but the man took a step forward. No, we're not done. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to stop her in her tracks. Shaq watched as the woman hesitated, her back still turned. She was debating something, calculating. It was clear now that she was hiding something bigger than just this one moment. The man took another step forward. You want to act like this never happened? Like no one here saw what you did? He gestured around to the crowd. That's not how this works anymore. People don't just get to walk away from their actions. Shaq shifted, watching the woman closely. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he could feel it. Something was about to unravel. The woman swallowed hard, and for the first time since this all started, she looked afraid. Not just of being exposed, but of something deeper. Something personal. Shaq glanced back at the man. There was something in his eyes. Something more than just frustration. This wasn't just about tonight. There was history here. And whatever it was, the truth was about to come out. The street felt heavier now, the air thick with an unspoken weight. The woman stood frozen, her back still turned, her shoulders stiff as if she were bracing herself for impact. The man with the phone didn't look away. His eyes locked onto her like he was waiting for her to acknowledge something. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing that whatever was about to happen next wasn't just about this one ugly moment. It was something deeper. Shaq shifted his weight, glancing between the two. He could feel it now, the way their tension wasn't just about tonight. There was something unspoken, something bigger that had existed long before this moment. He didn't know what it was, but he could tell it had power. Enough power to make the woman, who had been so full of arrogance minutes ago, suddenly look like she wanted to disappear. Then the man spoke again, his voice quieter this time, but each word cut through the silence like a knife. You thought you could keep running from this, didn't you? The woman flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Shaq caught it. The crowd did too. She turned slowly, her face now drained of its earlier confidence. Her lips pressed together tightly, her eyes darting around, as if searching for a way out. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked the sharpness it had before. The man let out a short breath, shaking his head. Lying won't work this time. He lifted his phone slightly. I've got proof. You think this is the first time people have seen who you really are? The crowd buzzed at that. People exchanged glances, whispers spreading through the air. Some who had been just bystanders now leaned in, their curiosity turning into something more. Shaq studied the woman closely. She wasn't just uncomfortable, she was unraveling. Her fingers twitched at her side, gripping her bag like it was the only thing holding her up. Her gaze flickered between the man and the surrounding crowd, and then suddenly she took a step forward, lowering her voice. "Please," she muttered, her tone no longer aggressive but pleading. "Not here." Shaq felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know why, but something about the way she said those words sent a ripple of unease through him. The way she looked around, the way her hands shook just slightly. It was almost as if she was afraid. The man exhaled, his grip tightening on his phone. For a second, it looked like he might actually give her a chance to walk away. But then he shook his head. "Oh, people need to see." The woman sucked in a breath. "You don't understand." The man's eyes darkened. "No," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't understand. You can't keep pretending that your past never happened." Shaq felt his pulse quicken. His past. Oh, past. What was he missing? The crowd had reached the edge of its patience now. The tension was unbearable. People wanted answers. A woman in the back finally spoke up. "What's he talking about?" The man turned, his expression grim. He looked at Shaq for a moment, almost as if debating whether or not to say it out loud. And then finally he did. "She's been doing this for years," he said. "Hurting people, getting away with it, pretending none of it ever happened." Shaq felt a chill run through him. The woman didn't argue. She didn't deny it. She just stood there, her breathing shallow, her face drained of color. And then, just when it seemed like she might finally speak, just when the crowd's anticipation reached its breaking point, someone gasped. Shaq turned instinctively, his heart pounding, trying to figure out what had happened. And that's when he saw it. The woman was reaching into her bag. The crowd pulled back slightly, uncertainty rippling through them. People weren't sure what to expect, but something about the way she moved, the desperation, the panic, sent alarm bells ringing in Shaq's mind. The man with the phone tensed, stepping back just slightly. "Don't," he warned. But the woman didn't stop. Her hand disappeared deeper into her bag, her breath coming faster. Shaq's instincts screamed at him. His muscles tensed, his heart pounding as he took a step closer, ready to react. And then, in the next second, everything happened at once. The woman's hand flew out of the bag, and the crowd gasped again, because what she was holding was something no one expected. The crowd collectively held its breath, eyes locked on the woman's hand as it emerged from her bag. For a moment, time seemed to slow, every second stretching into something heavier, more unbearable. And then, finally, they saw it. A small, folded piece of paper. Confusion rippled through the crowd. People had braced themselves for something else, something drastic, but now, instead of fear, there was uncertainty. Shaq felt his muscles unclench just slightly, but the unease in his chest remained. Because the woman, her face, her body language, she still looked as if she were on the verge of falling apart. Her hands trembled as she stared down at the paper, as if debating what to do with it. Then, in one quick motion, she crushed it in her fist. The man with the phone stepped forward. "What is that?" She shook her head, her breathing shallow. "Nothing," she muttered. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Whatever that was, it wasn't nothing. The man exhaled sharply, his patience running thin. "Enough of this. Show us." The woman's grip tightened, her knuckles turning white. It was clear she didn't want anyone to see it. But she had lost control of the moment, of the story. The weight of the crowd, the recording phones, the past she had been running from. It was all closing in. Shaq didn't take his eyes off her. His gut told him this was bigger than just a random racist outburst on the street. Something was hiding underneath all of this. The younger man from earlier, the one who had spoken up first, finally stepped closer. Just show us, he said, quieter this time. The woman squeezed her eyes shut for a second, as if preparing for something painful. Then, with a shaky breath, she slowly opened her hand. The crumpled paper was damp with sweat, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded too many times. With hesitant fingers, she smoothed it out slightly, just enough for the writing to be visible. And that's when Shaq saw it. Name. A name he didn't recognize, but one that clearly meant something to the man with the phone. Because the second his eyes landed on it, his entire expression changed. The confidence, the controlled anger, it all flickered for just a moment, replaced by something deeper, something closer to shock. The woman saw his reaction and swallowed hard. "I told you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. "You don't understand." Shaq's pulse quickened. What was going on here? The man with the phone shook his head, his eyes flicking back and forth between the woman and the paper. "Where did you get this?" His voice was different now, less demanding, more urgent. The woman licked her lips, hesitating. Then finally she whispered, "It was sent to me." A shiver ran through Shaq's spine. Sent to her? By who? And why? The man took a step back, running a hand over his face. His breathing had changed. Uneven, unsettled. He looked like he had just put something together that no one else had. Shaq felt the weight of the moment settle in. Whatever was happening right now, it was bigger than just this argument on the street. Bigger than just one person's hatred. It was something else entirely. The man slowly lowered his phone, no longer focused on recording. His gaze locked onto the woman, searching her face for something. "This isn't just about today, is it?" he asked, his voice low. The woman didn't answer. But she didn't have to. Because the look in her eyes said it all. There was something more. Something no one had seen coming. And whatever it was about to change everything. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The crowd leaned in, waiting, expecting answers that still felt just out of reach. Shaq's pulse pounded in his ears as he glanced between the woman and the man with the phone, both of them locked in some kind of unspoken war. Then suddenly, the woman exhaled shakily, her shoulders sagging. She looked down at the crumpled paper in her hands like it weighed 100 pounds. "I didn't want this," she muttered. "I swear I didn't." The man shook his head, his expression unreadable. "But you knew." Her lips pressed together. "I didn't have a choice." Shaq stepped forward, his patience running thin. "Somebody needs to explain what's going on," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Because from where I'm standing, none of this makes sense." The woman hesitated, gripping the paper tighter before slowly unfolding it completely. She turned it around so that Shaq and the crowd could finally see the full thing. It was a letter. Not just any letter. A typed message with no sender, no signature. Just a few chilling lines. "You know what happens when you don't follow orders. We're watching." The crowd murmured in confusion, some pulling out their phones, zooming in to read the words. But Shaq felt something else. A cold, sinking feeling in his stomach. The woman's hands trembled as she spoke. "I was warned," she whispered. "Told that if I didn't do something loud, something public, there would be consequences." The man with the phone exhaled sharply, closing his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them again, his voice was tight. "Who sent this?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Shaq clenched his jaw. "So you spat on me? Humiliated yourself? For what? To send some kind of message?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought if I did something small, just enough to make a scene, they'd leave me alone." The crowd wasn't buying it. People scoffed. Others muttered under their breath. The man's expression darkened. "You're telling me you weren't just being hateful? That someone forced you to do this?" The woman blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back tears. "I don't expect you to believe me," she whispered. "But I'm not the one in control here." Shaq exchanged a look with the man, unease prickling at the back of his mind. He had seen plenty of people try to weasel their way out of accountability before, But something about her reaction, her fear, felt real. The man sighed, rubbing his temple. "You think this letter makes you a victim?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, the only victim here is him." He nodded toward Shaq. The woman flinched, but then she did something no one expected. She turned and held out the letter to Shaq. He hesitated before taking it, his fingers brushing the paper lightly. It was real. The ink slightly smudged, the paper wrinkled from being handled too many times. He read the words again, slower this time. "We're watching." His stomach twisted. This wasn't just about some random woman's actions on the street. Something bigger was at play. And whoever was behind it, they were still out there. Watching. Waiting. Shaq looked up, meeting the woman's eyes. There was something broken in her expression. Something that told him the story wasn't over. And just as that realization settled in, something else happened. Phone rang. Not Shaq's. Not the man's. The woman's. He froze. The crowd went silent again. Then, slowly, with shaking hands, she pulled her phone from her bag and glanced at the screen. Her face drained of color. She didn't answer. She just stared, lips parted slightly, breath shallow. The phone kept ringing. And that's when Shaq realized. Whoever had sent that letter, whoever had orchestrated all of this, they were calling her right now. And they knew she had told the truth. The phone kept ringing. The sound felt louder than it should have, cutting through the silence like a knife. The woman's fingers hovered over the screen, her breathing uneven. She didn't decline the call. She didn't answer it either. She just stared, her face pale, frozen in place. Shaq glanced at the man with the phone, whose earlier anger had now faded into something more complicated. Neither of them spoke, but the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Who was calling? And what would happen if she picked up? The crowd had stopped recording, most of them now just watching, trying to make sense of everything. The energy had shifted. This wasn't just about a confrontation anymore. This was something deeper, something none of them had expected. Then finally the ringing stopped. The call went to voicemail. The woman exhaled shakily, but she didn't look relieved. If anything, she looked worse. She turned her phone over in her hands like she was debating something. And then, almost as if making a final decision, she slowly unlocked it and scrolled to her messages. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she turned it toward Shaq and the man, letting them see what she had just received. One new text. "You shouldn't have talked." A chill ran through Shaq. The man with the phone stiffened. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, but then shut it again, his jaw tightening. The woman let out a shaky breath. "Do you believe me now?" Shaq didn't know what to say. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to call her out for what she had done. But now, with everything that had unraveled, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just her actions. The man with the phone sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "So what now?" he muttered. "You just go home and wait for whoever's behind this to come knocking?" The woman swallowed hard. "I don't know what they want," she admitted. I thought if I played along it would be enough." Shaq studied her carefully. She looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying a weight for too long. He still didn't know if he could fully trust her, but he did know one thing. Whoever was behind this wasn't done. A thought occurred to him, and he frowned. "You said you didn't know who sent the letter," he said slowly. "But someone had to have a reason for targeting you. Is there anything at all, that connects you to them?" The woman hesitated. Then finally she nodded. "There was a man," she admitted. "I met him once months ago. He told me I had a choice. I could either be part of something bigger or be against it. I didn't take him seriously at the time. But then the letters started coming. Calls. The warnings." Shaq exchanged a glance with the man. This wasn't just a random threat. This was organized. The woman ran a hand through her hair, her voice barely above a whisper. I think they wanted me to recruit people," she admitted. "To spread the message. And when I didn't, they decided to make an example out of me." The man let out a low curse under his breath. So that's what this was, he muttered. They set you up. Forced you into the role of the villain to send a message to everyone else. Shaq exhaled slowly. Made sense. A public act, a spectacle. Something meant to go viral to spark outrage. And it had worked. The woman looked down, shame flickering across her face. I let it happen, she whispered. I thought if I just went along with it, it would be over. But it's never over, is it? Shaq shook his head. Not if you keep running. She looked up at him, then really looked at him. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there too. A realization, maybe. For a long moment no one spoke. The crowd had started to disperse, the energy shifting from confrontation to quiet murmurs. The phones were lowering. People were still curious, still watching, but the heat of the moment had passed. Jack could have walked away. He had every right to. But something told him that if he did, this woman would disappear, and whatever was behind this would keep going. The man with the phone sighed, shaking his head. Look, I don't know you, he said to the woman. And honestly, I don't care what happens to you after this. But if there's really a group out there pulling strings like this, people need to know. The woman let out a weak laugh. And who's going to believe me? Shaq crossed his arms. I don't know, he admitted. But if you want to stop running, maybe it's time to start talking. The woman hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't justice, not yet. But it was something. As Shaq turned to walk away, he felt the weight of the night settling in. The world wasn't as simple as it had seemed an hour ago. Some battles were bigger than one moment, one argument on the street. And this was only the beginning.